So I'll just give it another minute in case anyone's late. So thank you and welcome to today's webinar. We'll just give it a second while people come in, but I'll just introduce this session briefly before telling you a bit about ISEO and then telling you what to expect in today's webinar. So operating legally. So this is a webinar put on through the ISEO program, International Social Enterprise Observatory. And we're going to be talking today with our speakers about what you need to consider as a social if you want to expand your social enterprise outside of Scotland. So if we just move on, I'll ISEO from the slide deck as we go. If you've just come in late, just note that we are recording the session, so do turn your camera off if you don't want to be on the recording. So ISEO is an initiative that's pulled together a number of people that's really helping social enterprises here in Scotland who want to thrive on an international stage and play a leading role in embedding social enterprise in economies across the world. We're really proud of what Scotland has achieved. Social help people take that out in terms of their own business and practice, but also attract people in here to come and see what we're doing. In terms of our mission, we're really keen to promote social enterprise as an international leader. We're already hosting visits from various partners across the globe to come and see what's happening here in Scotland. And we've always got an open door to welcome more people to come and see what great work all of our social enterprises here are achieving. Very quickly on our objectives as an organisation. Expanding and building on Scotland's reputation as a global leader in the marketplace I've touched on, but we're really here to give that practical support to Scottish social enterprises to access international markets and opportunities as well. And that's very much what we're trying to do through today's webinar. I've said we're really proud of Scotland as a home for global social enterprise. We're trying to embed social enterprise in terms of international trade across a variety of policy and initiatives and really showcase what's going on here. In terms of resources and support, which is our last bullet point here, we are going to be sharing some links at the end of today's webinar, very much helping you as a social enterprise on the ground in terms of looking at how to operate on an international market. And so those will come out with the presentation at the end of our session today. In terms of how our session's running, I'm going to welcome James into the conversation now. So James from CEIS is going to be hosting today's conversation. We're always looking for ways to make operating legally an interesting topic and an interesting way of approaching it. So we won't be PowerPoint heavy in today's conversation. So James, do you want to just tell us a little bit in terms of our speakers in a minute? And I'll just run through quickly our agenda first as well. So we're going to be doing this really as a fireside chat. So James will introduce our speakers in a minute, but we're going to be roughly covering these broad areas as we go through our agenda. So we're going to look at due diligence, and that really follows on from our last webinar where we looked at mindset and customs really in terms of operating internationally. So how do you avoid the pitfalls of getting some of these things wrong? So we're going to start with that link to our last webinar when we look at this from a due diligence perspective today. We're going to be looking at routes to market. We often talk about legal structures in the social enterprise world. What does this mean for you on an international level? We're going to look at contracting. You've probably seen a word up there, Incoterms. We're going to be telling you what that means in today's session. So if you're wondering what that is, then you'll hear that from our speakers today. And as you can see from our slides, we're going to be covering a broad range of other topics: intellectual property, exporting, banking and currency, local standards and regulation, and anti-bribery and corruption. There's a chance for you to put Q&As in throughout the chat as we go along, but also we'll come to those Q&As at the end of today's session. So you haven't come to listen to me, you've come to listen to David and Robin. So I'm going to hand over to James now, who's going to introduce our speakers and take you through what we hope is a conversational piece about these issues here today. Thank you. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Naomi, and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining today. We're joined today by two fantastic speakers with a wealth of knowledge, and we're looking to share that with you today through the next hour or so. If we can just go to the next slide, please, Joe. We're joined today by David Gourley and Robin Fallas, who are both partners at McRoberts LLP, one of Scotland's foremost leading legal firms. David is very experienced commercial lawyer, and he's got his specialities have a wide range across all the kind of key aspects of doing business, and not just within the UK, but also internationally. So those aspects of commercial contracting, IP, intellectual property, security, anti-bribery, etc. Those things that we've said on the agenda, David will be talking to those in an international context. And Robin is one of Scotland's leading lawyers in regards to third sector and social enterprise legal structures. As you can see here, he's a member of the Law Society's Charity Law Subcommittee. And we've been working with McRoberts and Robin now for many years, providing really quite insightful advice and guidance in regards to the best legal structures to achieve their social missions. So David and Robin are going to be really sharing the breadth of that depth of experience through our fireside chat today. So Joe, if we could just lose the slides now and just bring on screen and spotlight David and Robin, that would be really great to see that. And you can see them both in the flesh. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the agenda and really just at the very start of someone's journey and considering international trade as a social enterprise operating in Scotland. So David, maybe if I can start off by just asking yourself, what are the initial steps that you suggest an organisation or an individual a social entrepreneur takes to start getting ready to trade internationally?
Okay, thank you, James, and good afternoon, everybody. It's certainly a good question. And in terms of starters for 10, we always talk about doing due diligence, but that's an often used expression. And I think it's worth just explaining what we actually mean by that. I mean, essentially, it's all about doing your homework as you would with any other exercise where you're wanting to ensure best success. So when we talk about doing your homework, it's all about planning ahead. If you're looking at trading internationally, then first and foremost, I think you need to identify what you believe to be your key markets, your priority markets. So where do you ideally believe that your goods or your services are best suited? Which markets do you think offer the most likely best rate of return on what you've been doing? So once you've identified those key markets, then if you have that shortlist to hand, I think it's then worth turning to what do you know about the particular market? And I'm thinking there about doing some research in relation to the culture of the market. Be very different, for example, looking to trade in the EU versus, say, South America. So it's understanding the culture, perhaps the local trade customs and practices, the behaviors, what are the norms? And really importantly, how do they differ from what you're actually used to? Because of course, you'll need to tailor your offering to the particular market. As part of the wider thinking around planning ahead, you probably need to have a revisit of your website, because your website might well be your key shop window or front to the world. And at the moment, that may be very focused, as it should be, on your local market, the market that you've been traditionally dealing with. But if you're looking to trade internationally, then I think it's worth revisiting again the proposition, how you present yourselves, and really how best to get or convey the message across. I think next, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, is really understanding the local laws which might apply to your business. So you might be perfectly comfortable and familiar with how you do business in Scotland, but once you start to look further afield, then the laws will be different, and it's just understanding to what extent they are different and how you need to adjust your business again to meet the challenges presented by those changes. I'd also recommend that you do further research using free resources that are out there. And there is a lot of assistance, and I know it's something that we'll signpost you later on in today's webinar, just about very helpful links where there's a wealth of guidance targeted towards businesses who are looking to trade internationally. And finally, I think as part of your planning ahead, it does no harm to reach out to others who have already walked this path, who've already decided to venture out beyond Scotland's borders. If they are operating in the markets that you are looking to target, then reach out, have that conversation, invite assistance, because I'm sure people are always more than happy to pass on the knowledge, the good and the bad that they've experienced from their journey overseas. So James, hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour for my preliminary thoughts just around due diligence and the need to do homework.
David. No, that's a nice introduction and giving people a real logical step process to starting that journey. And as you say, we will be sharing some resources later at the end. Some of those are free resources. We'll also be giving you an overview of the International Social Enterprise Observatory support offer, whereby we can provide specific business support through a number of different partners who are experienced in helping social enterprises to internationalize. So, and that support is fully funded and freely accessible for you. Just a question of making sure you're aware of that. And that aspect, Dave, that you mentioned about reaching out to other social enterprises who have already taken this journey. Regularly in the census of social enterprise, which happens every 2 years, between 5 to 7% of those identified social enterprises say that they're involved in some form of international trade. So, you can take an approximate number of about 500 organisations in Scotland who are social enterprises who are involved in international activity. So therefore, it is a good starting point to go and be able to speak to someone who's taken that journey before you. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit now and bring Robin into the dialogue, because I would imagine most of the social enterprises who are involved today will have a company structure based in Scotland as a social enterprise. I suppose the next consideration is that company structure that you have already in Scotland sufficient to be able to help to realise your international goals? So, Robin, if I can maybe ask you that question in regards to what are the key considerations for a Scottish-based social enterprise in regards to legal structures if they want to consider operating internationally, and what are some of the options that are open to them?
Thanks, James. I'll take that. I'll maybe overlap first with a couple of things David was saying, and it's sort of, as David was talking, there's a lot of things going through my head about different social enterprises we've already been involved in over the last few years. Kenya, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Mozambique, South America, India, Australia, US, Europe, all sorts of different areas, and for all sorts of different reasons. And I'll come back to the reasons because they tie into structures and approaches. Also, we've been involved in setting up on the other side, where there's been an international social enterprise seeking to set up in Scotland, which can also be helpful in the mix. And I suppose what's interesting coming to structures is some of them are driven to set up international structures because it's part of their social good, their social objective. You know, if they've designed a particular thing that has an application, particularly in Central Africa, then it immediately lends itself to needing to trade there. For some, it's market following, as David was indicating, where there's an opportunity, to make money, so it's going into there for revenue reasons. Very often, it's as a result of connections, be it from the Social Enterprise World Forum, the large Scottish event, or just generally, we see a large number of Scottish-based social enterprises that look to start doing things in Australia and India because they have connection partners there. Sometimes it's a university, sometimes it's a like-minded social enterprise, sometimes it's just an individual that they're connected with. And then quite often it's just the opportunity comes. And again, possibly that's off the back of something like the Social Enterprise World Forum. And I suppose those different factors come into play in structures, because if you come back to the different structures we'll have on the ground in Scotland, sometimes we'll have a community interest company, sometimes we'll have a straightforward company limited by guarantee, sometimes we'll have a charity in place in Scotland thinking about branching out. And whether their structure is appropriate quite often depends on what it is that they'll be doing overseas. If it's out and out business, then for a charity, their structure in the UK is fine, but they need to think about trading laws that come into play for charities and what they do. I had quite an interesting one a couple of years back. It was a Scottish-based charity, and they wanted to start operating in Eastern Africa. And so there is the question of, is our UK vehicle okay for this? And initially, it was, yes, you can simply set up a trading subsidiary, or sorry, an entity in I think it was Kenya. But then again, bringing in the direction that it's come from, there were a number of other philanthropists and funders who wished to be involved. So that moved it to saying, okay, maybe the UK structure needs to be a little bit more flexible, a little less regulated than a charity. So they took it in a different direction. Generally speaking, what we find is that there will usually not be a big driver to change the legal structure that there is in the UK or in Scotland in order to be able to trade overseas.
Okay, thank you, Robin. And it's interesting some of the range of countries that you've been involved with, and I'm sure each will get different individual challenges. It's important to maybe mention that if organisations who are looking to internationalise have got specific legal questions, then we are able, through the ISEO, International Social Enterprise Observatory, to facilitate support and advice from Robin and the team at McRoberts to help answer some of those questions. So don't feel that you are alone in having to make those discussions. We're here to support and assist you in that process with experienced partners. I'll move on now to this aspect of some form of training activity that you're going to be involved with. So that would likely involve a number of partners overseas, potentially customers overseas, and delivery agents or whatever it may be. So this aspect of relationship and contracting is where I'd like to go next with this one, and bring David back into the dialogue. And David, if I could ask from your perspective, what are the key considerations if you need to sign a contract with some form of international partner or client? What's involved in that?
Okay, thank you, James. Well, I think when we were looking at the potential structures that may exist for your trading entity, I think that's really key in terms of how will you actually contract with people overseas. I spent about 8 years on the board as a trustee with quite a large social enterprise in Scotland, and international became quite a big focus for the organisation, and the method of contracting was obviously a key consideration there. So I think if for example you have decided that you are a Scottish entity and that you're looking to do business overseas and you're going to continue with that particular vehicle as your route to customers, then you'll need to have a good look at your current terms and conditions. The chances are your terms and conditions will be, rightly so, very focused on the home market at present, and they probably will not address issues such as exporting to other countries. So I think first and foremost, it's probably a realization that there will be a need to do some work in relation to the terms and conditions. So if you're having a think about what is it you're actually providing, are we talking about particular goods? Are we talking about particular services? Then we need to have a think about how those items are going to move across overseas. And so looking at the contract is going to be really key to that. And as I said, I think in almost all cases, it's going to be a case of having an overhaul of what's already there. And of course, when we're talking about contracts, at the moment, we're proceeding on the assumption that it will be your terms which actually apply to the contract. That may not always be quite as straightforward, because you may find that it's the other party who actually wants to set out the terms and conditions which apply. And so again, that can necessitate a bit of rejigging in terms of where you would normally expect to be. You should also have careful thought about the language of the contract, because again, if it's your terms and conditions, fine, but if it's another party's terms and conditions, might you find that those terms and conditions are actually in a language other than English, in which case you need to be thinking very carefully about what that actually means in practice. So it's important to remove any potential risk of misunderstanding at the outset in terms of the terms which will apply. Now, there was mention earlier about how some types of contracting terms can come into their own when we're dealing internationally. And there was mention made of Incoterms. And if you've not come across Incoterms, these are model contract terms which have been introduced by the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC, for trading internationally. And they look to roll out model or standard terms for how the likes of goods are delivered, when title to the goods passes, when risk passes, who bears the costs of carriage and freight and so forth. So they're internationally recognized, and therefore, depending on what you're dealing with, there might be some merit in actually applying relevant parts of Incoterms to what you're doing. And the advantage of that, as I say, is it's an internationally recognized model, and therefore the party on the other side will hopefully already be familiar with Incoterms or have some knowledge of them, and that can make the whole contractual process somewhat easier than if you're starting from scratch and having to agree particular provisions around risk, title, and transport arrangements, delivery, and so forth. So I think that's probably the kind of key points at this stage, I'd say at a high level, James.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And I suppose with each of these topic areas, we could really do deep dives. We've got an hour today to try and give an overall summary. But as I said, if you find yourselves needing specific, more detailed advice on each of these, then that's something we can support you with. Those aspects of legal entity, of contracting, those are the things that maybe most organisations would be familiar with in regards to considering how they trade internationally. And maybe move on to some of the other factors that maybe not be as clear or foremost in your thought process when you're talking about international trading. And specifically, I'm talking here about intellectual property, which covers things like naming conventions, branding, logos, your website, trademarks, etc. So, David, if I could bring you back in this aspect and ask, what does an organisation need to think about to ensure that their intellectual property or the IP is suitably protected?
Okay, thanks, James. Well, I think first and foremost, the social enterprise should already have a clear understanding of what their IP actually is. I think that's really a prerequisite of if it's been successfully trading in Scotland and then it's looking to move overseas, then it should have this appreciation of what its IP is first and foremost. And it does no harm to actually just take a step back and identify all the intellectual assets that the enterprise actually has, and then give some thought as to how that can best be protected. Because when we talk about certain types of intellectual property, when we talk about rights which are capable of registration, and I'm talking about things such as trademarks or designs or patents, I think probably in this area we're most likely to be talking about trademarks, so people's brand, for example. Then registered intellectual property rights are what we call territorial in nature. Therefore, if you have registered a trademark in the UK, that will protect the relevant goods and services in the UK. But what that won't do is to protect your trademark and brand overseas. In the same way that if you had, say, a patent for an invention, it will be protected in the relevant country where it's been registered, but it won't be protected elsewhere. Therefore, one of the biggest decisions you've got to take at the outset is whether or not you need to consider taking steps to register your intellectual property rights in other countries. So for example, if you've chosen Brazil as a really key market and you have a registered trademark in the UK for your brand, you should be considering very carefully whether or not to register your brand in Brazil. But first of all, before you embark on your journey to Brazil, you would want to make sure that no one else is actually already using your trademark there, because you may find if you were to launch there and someone else already has rights in relation to that brand, you would actually be infringing the rights of that party there. So again, it's about doing your homework. What rights already exist in the market? Is there a gap? Are you okay to move in? If not, you need to really tread carefully. So I'd certainly say, first and foremost, making sure that your trading name, your brand are actually free for use. Make sure you're not infringing someone else's rights. And then, assuming it is all clear, think very carefully about trying to register your trademark in another country. Now, as you might expect, we've got some good war stories which have been built up over the years from just having advised various clients on intellectual property and going overseas. But perhaps beginning on a sort of lighter touch, where you have a brand, it's always important to make sure that that brand travels well. And by that, I mean that it actually works in the destination country. And there have been many examples over the years of very large multinational companies who've made quite important mistakes in terms of brand launches. So if you think it can't happen to the biggest, then think again. And just to give you a couple of examples. So KFC, for example, when it set up a franchise in China, the slogan, which you'll all be familiar with, finger looking good. Well, in Chinese, that translates as eat your fingers off. And so that didn't go down quite as well with the local audience. And we don't have to look too far for other examples. Mercedes-Benz also looking to enter into the Chinese market. They came up with a brand name called Benzi, but actually in Chinese that translated as rush to die. And so after that, Mercedes quickly rebranded in China to something close but sufficiently different called Benchy, which means run quickly as if flying. So these are light-hearted examples, but they're real-life examples of just being aware of how your brand might actually translate in another country. It may have a clear meaning in the UK, but it may have quite a different meaning in other countries. And just in relation to another sort of war story is we've acted in the past for people who've moved into other countries through appointing an agent. So that has the effect of someone else being appointed in the country to sell goods and services on your behalf. They're the agent, you're known as the principal. And we have seen examples where an agent was appointed, in this case it was in Japan, and unknown to our client, the agent had gone away and registered various trademarks of the client because the client hadn't done so himself, and the agent then started doing some business behind the client's back. And when the when the client did finally find out, okay, the agent's clearly in the wrong, they've clearly acted in bad faith, and that's one thing, but actually getting those trademarks back is another thing, because that takes a lot of time, energy, effort, and expense, and invariably, lawyers are involved. So what we'd say there is, again, come back to this diligence, doing your homework. If you're stopping that sort of behavior happening from day one, you'll put yourself in a much better position. And again, if you can use the benefit of other people's experience, good or bad, and these are all examples of things which were less than positive, then that will stand you in good stead. And I should emphasize, though, there's a huge upside to trading overseas, and I'm just dwelling on some of the things which you can take steps to avoid.
James,
yeah, please, Robin.
I was just going to jump in with a small point that's not sort of IP branding, but it's relevant to the question you were asking me before about sort of entity types, and it's a very live one, that the social branding aspect can be really important. So if you are looking to set up something in India, just one of those, again, if your target is, for example, the health service in India or the social enterprise sector in India, it will be important, maybe important to them to know whether the, let's call it the mothership back in the UK is a charity or fully asset locked, or how it is that it drives forward a social purpose. And again, I mentioned that we've seen this in the reverse. We saw that quite interestingly when North American social enterprise was looking to set up in the UK. They were very keen to understand whether the models met their particular level of asset lock. So that social branding aspect can be really relevant where you are trading through vehicles within different countries.
Thank you, Robin. And it's maybe just good to use that as a kind of key point to say, when we talk about social enterprise, we've obviously got a very clear understanding and definition of what that means in Scotland, but when we start to go international, the term social enterprise can maybe have the same degree of principles, but actually can be different in regards to those some key aspects. So really, the points that you make, I think, are very valid in understanding about that social branding.
And just one last thing on that, which can be really interesting. It's just an example that I've seen firsthand, that in one instance where there was a desire to replicate the level of asset lock in a new social enterprise in India to the one that was used in the UK. They looked into that, but ultimately they ended up having to change because of the complexity of the foreign direct investment rules that arose if you were structured in a way that got categorized as an NGO there. So you get interesting nuances around that area.
Okay. We were going to touch upon FDI, foreign direct investment, one of the later questions, Robin. Is it maybe suitable to bring it in at this point in time in regards to what are the kind of key legislative considerations that you need to be considerate of in international trading?
I think we could probably pick it up a little bit later on, but just as David was talking there, it's probably useful just to sort of remember the different ways in which we can trade internationally. I mean, David threw out the word franchise a minute ago, and again, we've got your contractual forms of trading. It might be distribution agreements where you enter into distribution agreements with like-minded enterprises or otherwise in other countries. You might have a franchise model. You might have a franchise model that's just contractual. You might have a franchise model that involves the setting up of enterprises. And again, maybe an easily readily identifiable one in that context might be something like the Homeless World Cup that puts on events around the world and uses that branding, etc. And I suppose that then brings in the other forms where you're going a step further and you're setting up your own actual entity in the particular country to carry out the trading. So again, it's just that those different models, the contractual models involving other parties, and then the setting up of a new entity. And again, I'll just tie that back to what I said earlier. Quite often it's driven by, what is it? Is it following a market on your own? Is it a connection? Is it, what's driving it often drives the way that you go into it. David, I don't know if you want to say anything more on any of those models briefly.
Thanks, Robin. Well, I think the key is for people to understand that there are lots of possibilities out there. One size does not fit all. I think, as you say, the reason for choosing a particular model might be dictated according to existing relationships and contacts, but you can look at a whole variety of things. We've touched upon just staying as you are, using your existing Scottish entity to do business overseas. Robin mentioned there potentially looking at incorporating an overseas company, which may or may not be the right thing to do, depending on the circumstances. And we've talked about the joint ventures. Do you partner with someone else? Do you actually set up a distinct legal entity with the other party? Or do you have that more as an informal relationship, a cooperation arrangement? We've talked about agency. Do you appoint someone to go out and sell on your behalf? Or if you've got your own products, do you sell them to distributor, and then the distributor goes out and sells them overseas, so effectively passing the risk on to the distributor? And then also just talking about franchisee type models, and I certainly dealt with things akin to a franchise in relation to social licensing of particular services, and that's a model which has been used in a number of countries. So I think flexibility is the watchword. I think be alive to the different options that you've got in terms of finding the route or the right route to the market that you have in mind.
Thank you, David. Thanks also, Robin. We're starting to unpick some of the detail that's involved in consideration of international trade, but I think it's important to know, don't be daunted. If you feel you're at the start of that journey, we're here to support you in that journey, with experienced professionals who can help us to do that. Some of the examples that have been mentioned so far, the Social Enterprise World Forum, the Homeless World Cup, the Social Enterprise Academy, all started up in the 21st century. So relatively new organisations that have then went on to have a significant international presence, and a key part of that has been that homework and due diligence that they've been involved with at the start to give themselves the best chance of being successful. So that's what we're here for. That's the purpose of the ISEO, is to work with you to do that. So please don't feel daunted, and actually hopefully you feel confident that the people that are around here to help you are aware of the detail of the pitfalls, and they're there to provide that support so that you don't actually take those mistakes, and makes it a much more successful venture for you. We've been through quite a wee bit of topic details so far, and I think it's important to maybe bring in the aspect of finance into this, because there are costs involved in regards to trading internationally. through a number of different aspects, be it duties, taxes, or fees. So I'd maybe come back in and ask David or Robin to consider, what are the kind of main costs associated with trading internationally that organisations need to be aware of?
I'll maybe kick this one off, James, if that's okay, because I suppose it links to what David said at the outset around due diligence, which also links to the sort of form of entity, which also links to the reasons why you're going for it. Because, if you're a charity, you shouldn't be sinking money at risk into setting up overseas trading that's going to fail and not do anything for you. So that's a sort of important point to make at the outset. In terms of going into this international trading, you really want a clear business plan, which is usually more you're doing, James, as you know, that clearly sets out that it's intended that this is going to generate a profit or generate whatever the social objective is going to be, and that needs to be sort of understood and agreed upon in the normal ways by the UK board of the social enterprise. And I suppose as part of that, if you're going to be putting that together, you need to understand the costs. And again, across those different models, the sort of contracting, franchise distribution, setting up an in-country entity, those are going to vary. You will usually need professional advice, covering both the UK and usually the country that you're going into. As an example, I was involved in one organisation that was setting up a social enterprise in Asia, and they needed to get quite a bit of HMRC advice on transfer of funds. So that's an example of the sort of UK advice that you may need. Another one recently is a Scottish-based social enterprise that's looking at having employees based in different countries. And again, it involves just looking at the UK employment law side of that and the UK tax treatment of how that works. And then there's the in-country aspects. So if it involves setting up an enterprise in, let's say, Kenya, what is the cost of doing that? But these will all be sort of fitted into the business plan, and there is no sort of way of saying trading internationally costs X. It's on a sort of form, and business plan basis. How are we going forward with that? So those would be my initial comments.
Okay, and anything, David, you'd like to add to that?
Well, I suppose if we strip things back to basics as well, as with any organization, but in terms of trading internationally, the intention will be to generate some revenue, accepting that this will be on a non-profit basis, but nevertheless the expectation is that there will be some money coming back to you. And I think one of the challenges, and this is not unique to social enterprises, but when you're looking to do business overseas, you're unlikely to be receiving payment in advance for what you do. There's going to be this bit of a lag in terms of providing items and when you can actually receive payment for them. So I think what organizations do need to consider how best to manage the potential risk. And we've certainly seen examples of social enterprises in Scotland dealing with other social enterprises in other jurisdictions, and for whatever reason payment has not been forthcoming, and then that obviously places both organizations in a difficult position. And it's how you can actually anticipate those types of issues. How do you manage risk? It's possible, for example, to get letters of credit, but again, if you got that from the other party, is that something which is realistic to ask of them? It certainly would manage your exposure. If you could also seek to get insurance, maybe bad debt protection or trade credit insurance, which might again help to offset the risk of not being paid by someone. But even then, those sorts of things carry a cost. So it's a trade-off between having some insurance in place and not. But you can certainly look at the likes of export finance and insurance if that's the route that you wanted to go down. I mean, I suppose other issues, perhaps for the first time you'll be dealing with revenue coming in different currencies. So you might be receiving money from someone in, whether it's euros, dollars, or drachma, whatever. And I think you need to be alive to being able to receive that money, to be thinking about who's bearing the cost for the bank transfers, and if you're not being paid in sterling and you have to convert it to sterling, are you the one taking the risk on any fluctuations in currency? So it's just being alive to those sorts of things which might throw themselves up, which you might not otherwise have dealt with previously if you're looking at trading internationally for the first time.
Thank you, David. I'm going to just say a specific comment, and then I'm going to introduce a comment or a question from Keely, who's put it into the chat. And that aspect of financial modelling is once again some of the business support that you can access through the ISEO in a free basis. So being able to actually do the financial modelling and put some scenarios in there in regards to things like currency and also things like payment terms. We can start to introduce that and to ensure you're giving due consideration to the different financial relationships that could be in place. David, Keely has asked a specific question, and you've actually kind of covered some of it, I think, in your last comments, but I'll be very specific in asking the question that she's asked, which is, could you comment on local taxation, particularly withholding tax and getting cash back out of the country?
What a horrible question, but a very good question at the same time. Robin's smiling because I've got this one. So Keely, special thank you for that. Well, first and foremost, you're obviously talking to two lawyers here. And my advice would always be go and see a good accountant in terms of the local rules. But seriously, local taxation rules, you've got to do your homework because, again, it would depend on the particular country in question and what the rules actually are. And this is something where, as James and I have both alluded to already, you can be signposted in terms of the assistance which is available to get particular advice on local taxation rules. If you're finding that your focus is on a particular market, then that would probably justify digging into. I'm going to go back to my Brazil example. If that's the country of interest, then getting particular advice around the local taxation rules there, because again, yes, getting cash out of a particular country can be potentially problematic depending on the country that you're talking about. And so I think, there's no substitute for seeking advice and guidance in relation to these topics, which will vary from country to country. So it's very difficult to give a one-size-fits-all answer to what is, I appreciate, a very real question.
David, I'll maybe add a small comment that's not necessarily going to take it that much further, because neither David or I are tax lawyers. But again, got exactly this scenario at the moment in an Asian social enterprise being set up in country. And yes, linking it back to the last question on costs, we're needing to incur the costs. I think I mentioned HMRC on money transfers, but we're also needing to incur costs with accountants and lawyers in country on the position there. I think in the resources and through the activities that we've done with James and others, there are various ways of accessing that information that are not necessarily at full cost, and there's various networks that can be tapped into to assist the social enterprise sector in Scotland. James, I don't know if you want to pick that one up.
Absolutely, Robin, you're a star, because one of the things that I'll be introducing at the end is the next webinar, and at that point in time we'll be talking about international networks and the benefits of using your international networks. And within the social enterprise international networks that we have an ability to engage with like-minded organisations in country who can provide that degree of expertise and guidance as well, or relationships who can solicit that guidance, you know, in different ways. So absolutely, you know, we can help to address this. The resources of ISE are finite, you know, so engaging an expensive lawyer, you know, elsewhere is probably out with the boundaries of the resources that we do have. But as you said, there are other mechanisms that we can bring to bear that can help to provide suitable advice that should be able to, you know, help to navigate through those specific circumstances. We've now been kind of running for probably, you know, 45, 50 minutes, and I don't want to take it too, you know, far in regards to closing. So probably in the next 10 minutes or so, I think what we'll do is we'll try and finish off on the key kind of discussion topics, and then you'll all have a chance to ask any questions at that point in time. So if you want to even think about putting those into the chat, then I'm happy to bring those up, or if at that time you want to come on screen and ask, then Robin and David will be delighted to help. A couple of last questions, and Robin, I kind of touched upon it earlier, and you mentioned it briefly about legislative considerations, and you had a specific example of talking about things like foreign direct investment. So this aspect of what are the key legislative considerations that you need to be conscious of, and also does that cover into things like packaging, labelling in different countries, and how you can take consideration of those. So I'll hand it over maybe to yourself, Robin, to start off, and then maybe to David to come in at that point in time, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, James. Yeah, this is probably the trickiest bit. It's the other end. It's the international end of my trade here, the international end of what I'm doing that's new to me. I don't understand the set of rules. I don't know if they're the same as the rules that are in the UK. I've got a grip on the rules in the UK because I'm already operating there and I know my onions there. And yes, there is potential for significant divergence. You know, packaging, you just take whatever it was, the BPA, I think the rules in Europe are sort of 20,000 times tighter than the rules in the UK. And that's just on an element of packaging and what you can use. There's little things like that will change between different areas. And it's sort of impossible to say, well, this is what you need to know about everything. There are going to be specific things impacting different social enterprises. From my own perspective, just to choose a couple of other ones, if you take India and the UK, the company law operates in a fairly similar way in its structure, but again, in the context of a relatively recent social enterprise setup, you suddenly get thrown up the need to understand the legislation and in the number of in-country directors that you need to have on a board, the rules around residency and all of this. Just you will get legislative differences between the UK and the international country in all sorts of different ways. So again, it links back to the last couple of questions. If you're going into these areas, particularly where it's you setting up there rather than somebody in country that has that knowledge, be it a distributor or a franchisee that sort of may bear the risk of the compliance with a large number of things, then you need to get a handle on them and understand them using the networks we talked about.
Thank you, Robin. David, anything you'd like to add on top of what Robin said?
Well, I think, James, yeah, it's really, there is no book out there which tells you in a manner you must comply with the following laws and regulations for this country and that country, because there's a myriad of different things to consider. if we take the example of consumer protection laws, for example, the UK is really quite robust there. And the EU also has laws. In fact, the UK and the EU's laws are very closely aligned on consumer protection, given that we were part of the EU until very recently. But we may find that when you're looking to go elsewhere, that there might be some particular requirements of consumer law which are novel to a particular country in question and which must be observed. And it's how do you find out about those? As we've said, taking advice from an expensive local lawyer is probably not going to be viable for most, if not all, social enterprises, and therefore it's using the networks there to provide the guidance. And it's the same, you know, there might be particular rules on how you might be able to advertise or market in those countries. And the last thing you want to do is fall foul of those types of restrictions. So again, it's trying to be signposted to relevant guidance and people who can assist with complying with those local laws and regulations, because otherwise it might feel a bit daunting at first, but there's no need to be intimidated, because you know other people have done it. It's not mission impossible, but it's just knowing who to ask and where to go.
Yeah, thank you, David.
James, just one
yeah.
final comment on that, because again it links back to the different forms of trading internationally, and the one that makes that understanding the legislation really difficult and needing to be addressed is if you're going in on your own without sort of connections, setting up something new in country. That sort of is, if you like, pulling in all of that and putting it on your plate. Whereas the other models, or you may partner up, join up, do a joint venture, work with an in-country person that's like-minded. You know, I've worked with social enterprise architects, for example. If they're setting up in a new country, then they can start up on a contractual or joint venture basis with someone in the country who knows the setup relevant to their operation within their country. So just worth making that point.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you. We're kind of coming to the end now of the kind of dialogue, which hopefully you found to be quite informative. We've talked about due diligence, we've talked about structure, we've talked about contracting, intellectual property, some of the costs associated with doing business through duties, taxes and fees, aspects related to banking, currency and insurance, and legislation. So maybe all of those aspects, you know, or most of those you might have had in your mind prior to joining today's call, but maybe one that might be maybe less of a consideration for you, but you know, should be absolutely at the forefront of your thought process, is this aspect in regards to anti-bribery and corruption. And you know, doing business in different environments brings in different considerations. So if I maybe ask David and Robin to come back in as a kind of final feedback on what are the kind of key considerations and what the organisations need to be conscious of in regards to anti-bribery and corruption as they're thinking about engaging internationally.
Okay, thanks, James. Robin, I'm happy to take that question at first pass. I think this comes back again to understanding the customs and practices of the country that you're dealing with, but also not losing sight of where you've come from, because it might surprise some people to know that there is UK legislation on bribery and corruption. That's not the surprise, but what can be the surprise is its international reach. So potentially it can attack behavior which is happening in other countries. So it goes without saying that no one is going into a new venture with the intention of engaging in any form of bribery or corruption. But what you need to make sure is that you do not inadvertently fall into any traps which might be reflective of local custom and practice. So for example, if a customs official is asking for what we'd call a facilitation payment in order to expedite the granting of say, a license or an import certificate. Now, if that backhander is just a way of greasing the individual's hand, as it were, even though that might be quite endemic in a particular market, you need to understand that that would fall foul certainly of the UK bribery legislation, and could therefore potentially put you under the risk of enforcement action there, but it might also then breach local laws on anti-bribery and corruption. So you don't want a sort of double whammy of breaching two sets of laws. So I think it's very important to, as I say, to understand what is the practice, what is the culture, but just because something is actually quite endemic, perhaps in one part of the world, does not make it right. And therefore, you need to be very, very careful about what you're doing. So we'd always say, when you're looking to trade internationally, you've got your own internal controls around anti-bribery and corruption. And I think really key at that is it being led from the top down, but also staff being provided with training and awareness, so education around the do's and the don'ts, because just because something happens regularly in a particular country does not make it right. And therefore, it's good to have a policy on anti-bribery and corruption, which staff are familiar with and can understand. And if they've got any concerns, then they can report back to you. So I think it's just to be aware, because like I said, people are not going out there with the intention of breaching those types of laws. You just don't want to inadvertently fall into the trap of doing something just because so many other people do it.
Just to follow up on that, first is a not quite helpful comment, because I remember there is a piece of guidance, I just can't quite remember where it comes from at the moment, whether it's the International Division of Government or whether it's the Charity Commission, but I remember a very useful piece of guidance on what those who are operating internationally should do. So I'll follow up on that. But in particular, that's led to two practical examples that I can think of the same thing. One, which through, as a trustee of a particular charity, we made sure that we were getting declarations back from our contracting partners in particular countries to where they would confirm to us that they had not engaged in bribery. And again, it's sort of having these processes to be able to point to in terms of compliance with the UK bribery legislation. And just a transactional one, relatively recent, again, in a country where it's part of the custom, we're having to be very careful in the course of a particular land purchase to say, okay, well, that might be the way it's usually done, but we have this obligation on us in the UK, so we need to make sure that we have compliance with that. So it does arise readily in international social enterprise structures.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin and David, for that. Those final comments. That's the last of the discussion points today. So hopefully you've all found that to be, I don't know, comprehensive yet, a summary level of detail that gives you some really good that introduction to the key considerations for trading social enterprise internationally. What I'd like to do, I see a couple of comments there. Fiona, I don't know if you want to expand on your comment that this is the single biggest issue you've encountered. I think you may have posted that at the time we were talking about the last topic of anti-bribery and corruption, but I'm not quite sure if you wanted to expand on that. And also, if Keely, if there's any specifics that you'd like to ask, please, now's the chance to do that. Alternatively, if you feel there's any follow-up conversations, then we're happy to facilitate those individually with you to explore some of the kind of key points that may be on your mind. So I'll give you that chance just now. Anyone who'd like to come in and raise a hand or in the chat, or come on screen and ask anything of David and Robin directly, or if not, we can do that, as I said, on a one-to-one basis.
Right, thank you. I just wanted to, this is Keely. So thank you very much for this. It's been really useful. I don't have any more specific questions at the moment, but yeah, thank you very much. It's been very informative and reassuring, because I feel like we're actually doing things right. So it's always a promising.
Good, excellent, Keely. Thank you for coming on screen and commenting. Joe, could I ask you to bring up the remaining slides, please? Because what I just want to do is just give you some further resources that are available freely from reputable UK government websites that would really, give you some further reference points for consideration. So the great.gov.uk website really provides, some useful resources across a range of kind of topic areas, really about, that some of the topics that we talked about today in regards to payment, logistics, bribery and corruption, etc., with a little bit more detail, but also the practical aspects of in relating to the due diligence. Dave was talking about doing the homework, about creating an export plan and finding an export market and understanding your routes to market. So the great.gov.uk website is a really useful resource. Joe, could you bring up the next one? Which is the UK government's export guide, and that provides a step-by-step guide for you in regards to how to move goods from the UK to international destinations. So really nice resource there again, providing that kind of step-by-step process. And next slide. And in regards to export finance, in regards to financing, David mentioned about guarantee schemes, insurance. So some of those resources in there as well on UK government's export finance website are also very helpful. And lastly, in regards to protecting your intellectual property abroad, once again, UK government resource that provides you some specific guidance and considerations on some of the topics areas that we talked about today. So those, as I said, the ISEO is here to support organisations, social enterprises in Scotland to internationalise. Joe, if I ask you to bring up the next slide, please. Because I just wanted to maybe, for those who are not familiar too much with ISEO, just give you a summary of the kind of the service offer that collectively the organisations who come under the ISEO umbrella, which is led by our organisation at CEIS, but also includes a range of other social enterprise support organisations in Scotland. So just from the inquiry, if you want some one-to-one business support, then we can provide that directly, once again, on a funded basis. Legal support, Mick Roberts, Robin and David are there through the ISEO with specific support on any legal matters or questions that you may have, be it structures, IP, contracting, wherever it may be. So once again, through the ISEO, we're able to facilitate that. Incubation and in-country support. So, one of the key delivery partners for ISEO is the Challenges Group based in Edinburgh. And Challenges have got 5 international offices who have worked in 72 different countries, and have got access to in-country support from specialists who can provide that market research and market development and introductions, partners identification, etc. So once again, through ISEO, the Challenges Group can provide that dedicated support. Access to global networks, and our next webinar will be looking at international networks, and at that point in time, we're going to be profiling a little bit about the Social Enterprise World Forum and the opportunities that that provides for making some fantastic international relationships and networks. So the next, as I said, webinar, if you tune into that one, you'll find out a little bit more about how we can introduce you to those global networks and how that can help to support your internationalization journey. And then, there's aspects of grant funding whereby, depending upon the type of development work that you want to do and the markets that you want to access. Then through the Challenges Group, they've got specific grant funding to help facilitate that. Also, Scottish Government International Development Fund has got specific funding priorities as well, and that's on the Scottish Government's IDF website. And then, for those who need access to further finance, then the opportunity to access some patient capital to help facilitate your growth plans is also there through both the Challenges Group CEIP funding up to £150,000. So hopefully that gives you a good summary of the ISEO. Once again, I emphasise the ISEO is here to help you to internationalise the social enterprises. The support that's provided is done so on a funded basis. So it's really there, to help facilitate whatever your support needs are to provide that for you. Joe, if we go to the next slide, please. And that just summarises the kind of key types of service options that the ISEO can offer. Business planning, financial modelling, market research, in-country intelligence, understanding identification of best practice, commercial model developments, intellectual property legal structures, contractual support, global partner identification, grant funding, etc. So really quite a holistic offer of support available through the ISEO. And if I go to the next slide, Joe, which is our final slide, it's really just to say if you want to access any of that support through ISEO, please just get in touch. Contact the ISEO website and just fill in the contact form, or just use the admin@iseo.scot email address, and that will come to us and we'll be back in contact. Okay. Any last chances or opportunities for anyone in questions? Or if not, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else in chat, which I don't see. So I'd just like to take this last chance to thank Naomi for her introductions today, to thank Robin and David primarily for the expertise and guidance that they've shared with us in the examples, which I think hopefully you found very insightful, that I did. And just to say thank you for joining today. Please look out for the communications from the ISEO about the future webinars, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one talking about international networks. So thank you.